say unto him, I pray thee, let my sister Tamar come and give me meat, and dress the meat in my sight, that I may see it, and eat it at her hand. So Amnon lay down and made himself sick. And when the king was come to see him, Amnon said unto the king, I pray thee, let Tamar my sister come, and make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat at her hand. Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, Go now to thy brother Amnon's house, and dress him meat. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was laid down. And she took flour and kneaded it and made cakes in his sight and did bake the cakes. And she took a pan and poured them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, I have out all men from me. And they went out every man from him. And Amnon said unto Tamar, Bring the meat into the chamber, that I may eat of thy hand. And Tamar took the cakes which she had made, and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. And when she had brought them unto him to eat, he took hold of her, and said unto her, Come lie with me, my sister. And she answered him, Nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. And I, whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee. Howbeit he would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than she, forced her, and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, Arise, be gone. And she said unto him, There is no cause. This evil in sending me away is greater than the other that thou didst unto me. But he would not hearken unto her. Then he called his servant that ministered unto him, and said, Put now this woman out from me, and bolt the door after her. She had a garment of divers colors upon her, for with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparelled. Then his servant brought her out, and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head, and rent her garment of divers colors that was on her, and laid her hand on her head, and went on crying. That's heavy stuff. And not exactly the first thing we grab for when we want to read the children a bedtime story. But why is it there? This and many other places in the Bible are quite graphic stories of horrible things that have happened to people. I wanted to take the opportunity tonight to talk about something that I don't know that I've ever heard talked about in a public meeting with the church. I'd like to talk about sexual abuse in the church. There's more than a few reasons why this is on my mind. Okay, let's start with big picture stuff, okay? I talk a lot about, and I think a lot about, power discrepancies. And I'm worried that sometimes when I talk about that stuff, people think I'm being weird and just like, I don't know, either a hippie on one end or trying to be a psychologist on the other. But what's really important about how we look at power, interpersonal power, like who's over who's in power or authority over who's under power and authority, these are really consequential matters. Because abuse and violation of power are rampant in human societies. I mean, the Congress today started an impeachment for the President of the United States over abuse of power. And whenever Jesus is conditioning us to be skeptical of those with power. Now, there are certain places where I have power. I have a kind of power with my wife. I have a kind of power with my children. I have a kind of power in my business. I have a kind of power as an American. I have all kinds of situations where I'm the powerful one in a relationship. And in those places, my culture teaches me to leverage that, to use that, and to build that. And my faith teaches me to be suspicious and wary and to consider that power a dangerous thing. And when that power gets corrupted, people get hurt. It's not, it doesn't go without my notice that Amnon was the heir apparent. He's David's oldest son. He's the most powerful in the house. He's the one that should take over for his father. He's the king's firstborn. And remember what he says here, what Jonadab says to him, this wicked man. Why art thou, being the king's son, lean from day to day? What's wrong with you? You have all the power. You're the strong one here. Why are you bothered? You should be leveraging your power. You should be influential. You should be happy. So he does exactly that. He leverages his power over those that are weak around him. It can't escape our notice that sex scandals and sex abuse are not a Roman Catholic thing. They're not things that are happening in dark Gothic churches behind robes and altars. They're very, very present among our people. I have personally known and been close to, in churches where I have been, I've been in close church fellowship with 3 pedophiles in 20 years that I know that were exposed. In one of those cases, I was the first person that was called by the daughter who was being abused. And these situations, for all the commonality, for as often as they're happening, are being very, very seldom talked about in open meetings. And I don't think that's helping us. I want to try to change that culture, at least among us, that we can talk about these things. I take a certain kind of license that things like this in the Bible are spoken about, and so I'm going to take the opportunity to speak about them too. Excuse me. I want to talk about how to protect ourselves. These things are horrible things that happen, and maybe there's certain components to them that are tragedies like an earthquake or like a fire, and there's nothing we can do. But there are many things that we can do to minimize the danger to our children and to other people around us if we just start thinking about these things and being proactive. So I want to suggest some proactive ways to think about sexual abuse and what we can do as a community to try to minimize the danger. The first thing is that I'm going to say things that I'm going to say several things tonight that I hope don't even need to be said, that I hope are repetitions, that I hope are redundancies, that I hope are things that you've already talked in your families about, but I'm not going to leave stones unturned. If we're going to talk about this, then let's talk about it. So starting first things first, children should be taught, no one touches you, wear your underwear covers. From a very little child, you can teach them that. As soon as they know that they're naked, as soon as they start to be aware of their nakedness, you can teach them, no one should ever touch you, wear your underwear cover. It's a very simple, not too much, not too little, easy way to explain to children what's dangerous about touch, and that you shouldn't touch anybody else in the places where their underwear cover. That's step one. With very little children, we teach them this, so that they're conditioned to know. And in my home, now, I've learned some things, but now, like with my younger sons, you know, Cephas has toileting needs because of his condition. So I'm in the bathroom with him almost every time he goes. And I remind him from time to time, no one touches you, wear your underwear covers. Mama and Papa can if you need to for the bathroom, and the doctor can, but outside of that, no one touches you there. That's it. And remind him from time to time so he knows what's the difference between safe touch and unsafe touch. Who's okay, who's not? Where are the parameters behind? And he asked me just the other day we had this conversation, and he said, why? Well, I'm not going to explain all the complexities of sexual abuse to a little child. You don't have to. There are things, and I'll say that about, and I hope that I'm not crossing anybody's family lines. I know different people do this at different rates, so I'm trying to be careful. But there are ways to explain things that are safe for children that start conversations so that they know. And so I just told them, there are some people who have hurt children by touching them that way. That's enough. That's all a little child needs to know. I'm protecting you, I'm watching over you, and as they grow, you can teach them more and more that they need to learn. That should be status quo. Another thing that I want to mention about sexual abuse is that we should be mindful of grooming behaviors of predators. It's very common that predators groom their victims, and what I mean by that is they prepare them to be victimized. And those grooming behaviors are varied. They're very manipulative. So what happens oftentimes is that a predator will give commands to children, especially in the presence of other authorities or their parents, and get them to obey them and listen to them in front of their recognized authority so that they can manipulate them when those people aren't around. That kind of psychological manipulation happens with predators. Another thing is flaunting touch, like touching children in almost inappropriate, just a little bit edgy kind of ways when people are around to acclimate children to being touched inappropriately. Grooming behaviors include sitting on laps, tickling. I wasn't abused as a child, but I've always hated the idea of tickling with children. It creeps me out. It always has, ever since my oldest children were little. Don't tickle. That's not an appropriate way to touch people. I'm not saying you're a creep if you tickle children. I'm just saying it's always bothered me when I see it around my children. I've always said, don't do that. You should be very careful with those kinds of behaviors. Now, like most fathers, I get on the floor and I roll around and I wrestle with my children. That's good and healthy and appropriate. But especially children that aren't yours, tickling behavior just kind of is weird. It shouldn't be normal or accepted. It's not a right way to touch people's children. It's creepy. Speaking of that, if someone creeps you out around your children, pay attention to it. I don't care who it is. I don't care who it is. If anyone makes you feel uncomfortable around your children, pull your children in and be mindful and watch. Let me repeat. If anyone creeps you out around your children, pull them in, keep a hawk eye, watch. Because as a parent, you're tuned to watch for comfortable things around your children. You have all kinds of mechanisms in your mind and in your heart that are happening behind the scenes of conscious thought to trigger you to be careful with your children, listen to those things. My family has decided, since my oldest children were young, not to do sleepovers. My children sleep in their beds. They don't spend time at other people's houses overnight. It's just, I've never seen the value of it. So for my family, that's one thing I've done in a protective capacity. I don't want my children staying in somebody else's home under somebody else's supervision overnight. Different people are at different places with that. I know some people are around cousins and family, and maybe that changes some dynamics, but for us, that's been a practice that we've stuck to. In general, I think that the idea of watching for people manipulatively taking authority over children that are not theirs is a danger sign, and it should be watched for. In the cases of abuse, the reason that abuse stays secret for very long times, and sometimes for a person's whole life, and they never disclose the abuse that they've suffered, is because there's a lot of that power dynamic manipulation over victims by by predators and people who offend. And that includes things like telling people who are victimized that they'll get in trouble because there's innate guilt and shame around those kinds of actions. Predators will play on that and tell, especially children who are violated and abused, that they'll get in trouble if they tell anybody. We need to make sure that children especially know, if someone touches you inappropriately, come and talk to someone. That ought to be a message that goes out from time to time, that all children in our care, under our authority and our responsibility, know, if anyone's touching you inappropriately, come and tell someone in the church. Tell someone, you won't be in trouble, we want to listen to you, it's not right, and we'll help you. That's a message that all of our children should know and understand. They're told that they'll be in trouble. They're told that they're dirty, that these things will make them unwanted. This happens especially with older girls being abused. No one will want you if they know. I've heard these things from victims, that they're told that they're defiled now and that no one will want to marry them if people knew that they were abused. These just add trauma and scar onto the abuse. That's horrifying. Physical dominance, just like in the story of Tamar, physical dominance makes people feel helpless, makes victims feel like there's nothing they can do, or like they're in danger or threatened if they were to try to do anything. Sympathy gets manipulated, especially because so much abuse happens from people who are close to the victim in family relations. It's aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers. Relations are, at least in the world, many cases of abuse are happening within some kind of family parameter. I'm going to take out that "in the world" part of that sentence. Most people who are abused by someone that they're related to. It's very common. And so a part of that manipulation is that if people found out, then they'd hurt me, or I would go away forever, or I wouldn't be around the family, or whatever the case may be. And the child's relationship to the abuser is leveraged against the victim in sympathy for the offender. It's common, especially again with older children, that there's some kind of I'm going to teach you about marriage. I'm going to prepare you for marriage. I'm going to show you how your body works. That kind of language is used in cases of abuse very frequently. In order to offset those kinds of power dynamics, I would say I really endorse the idea of family unit. Now, if someone in the family is an abuser, that can cause a problem, but I don't think that most families are abusive, especially in the church. There ought to be kind of like sometimes I call it like the Milioni gang. I'm from a gang, so maybe that's not the best terminology, but like when I take all my children to a McDonald's play area or something, like we kind of take over the place, right? Like there's, I remember when I just had a few children, you go to a playground and it's like there's 3 big children running around pushing everybody and being mean. Well, that doesn't happen now when you show up with 10 children. Like the children go and they're taught to be nice and they're taught to play with other people and be kind, but they're kind of a pack. And they insulate each other well as a pack. If you have a pack, use it. Keep them together and create a culture where they like being with each other and in each other's presence. There's a certain kind of safety and insulation and protection from having that kind of family culture. It's insulating even in meetings, even when we're all together, that we kind of cluster in these little family groups. And there the children sit. The idea behind this is that the children stay close to the family, visibly, audibly close. That as parents, I want to hear what my children are doing when they're playing, when they're by themselves, when they're doing their thing over here and we're talking or we're working or whatever we're doing. that they're within earshot and within eyesight, so that they can be monitored, so that we can know what's happening with them, so that we know that they're okay. Those are kind of important practices, and it helps keep supervision usable. If we design family units that way, where they kind of cluster together, where they're happy playing under their parents' supervision, where they're content playing where they can be seen and heard, there's a lot of good things that come from that. And I think we have to, the impulse against this is that it gets loud or rowdy, and so then we say, go in the other room. And so we send groups of children off to bedrooms to play by themselves, and then we don't know what's happening. It's much, much better in the long run, for everybody's good and for a lot of reasons, to teach the children in a group setting to play quietly. It doesn't mean like sit there and like robots and don't move. You can play, sit on the floor and play, but play quietly. You don't need to scream, you don't need to yell, you don't need to run around. Just sit here and enjoy each other's company. Here's some cards, here's some Legos, here's something. Just be calm and play. We are together a lot, and I know that sometimes that's difficult, but it's not impossible. It just requires some training and some expectations as a culture that that's how the children are. We can have adults sit in a circle around a room and have children playing, either off to the side or in the middle of the room, and just deal with the ones that are being loud. Say, hey, you need to be quiet. You don't need to scream here. Calm down. Take them out, deal with that, come back in, whatever it is. Create an environment where children are happy and content playing under supervision. It's good for everyone. I think it's important to offset those potential abuse patterns, to teach children about inappropriate and appropriate touch. I know not everybody, some people are more prone to physical touch than others. I'm a fairly touchy person. I like to hug my children. I love to kiss the brethren when I meet them and greet them. I want my children to understand proper touch. I want to know that it's nice to have your father's hand on your shoulder, or to have a hug when you leave the house. I want them to have good associations with appropriate physical touch, because it's an important part of human relationships. And it's an important part that we should cultivate. It makes you healthy to understand appropriate physical touch. It's isolating to never be touched. It's isolating emotionally and physically. We want healthy, whole people out of our children. And for them to learn how to hold hands or have a hug or have a hand on their shoulder is good stuff for them. And it creates a condition that they understand the difference. If they were to be touched inappropriately, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel appropriate. It doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't feel right. And that disparity, hopefully, is protective and will cause them to leave that situation if they can, or disclose it if they can't. I think that one of the problems, and especially in the abuse cases that we've been hearing about within plain circles in the last several years, is that prudishness and repression are not healthy. Sex is not a bad word. It should not be uttered in hushed tones or never to be uttered. Understanding anatomy and a body and reproduction, all those things, here's the fact. Your children are going to learn those things. The only question is if they're going to learn them from you. I want my children to learn about those things from me. So we teach them. You have to do that on purpose, or someone else will. Either the world will, or pornography will, or advertising will, or their friends will, or somebody will. Somebody's going to teach them if you don't. That's a fact. Hyper-modesty, I've encountered this in my years as a radical. Hyper-modesty, I think, I'm going to say something bold here, is a kind of perversion. If you think that seeing someone's ankles or forearms is suggestive sexually, you're messed up. You have a problem. It's not normal. And creating cultures with that kind of hypermodesty is not healthy. I think very often of some of the experiences that we've had raising children around plain culture. And like, I hate the idea that these poor women have to go sit in a room by themselves somewhere to feed their babies. Breasts are for feeding children. That's their primary function. That's not weird. Everywhere in the world, in the developing world, that's the primary understanding of a woman's anatomy. I'm not saying that we need to have no concern for modesty. I'm saying that if my wife is sitting in a room talking with people and someone can hear her baby nursing, feels uncomfortable and has to go away, they're wrong. Something's wrong with them. Something's not wrong with her, and something's not wrong with the baby. Something's wrong with them. Fix that. Get some help. Talk to somebody. That's not normal. You've been hypersexualized by your culture or by your sin or by something. That's not normal. I have an idea. Now, this stuff is very important to me. I really think this is an important thing for us to be talking about. I'm going to take the risk of sharing a personal opinion here. So don't throw everything I'm saying in with this what I'm saying right here, but I want to share a personal opinion with you, and I'll submit it to you and you can think about it. I think that it's important to question our society's and our culture's values around sex and body image. What I mean by that is, for instance, I don't think there's anything in the natural world that conditions people to expect women to be hairless. So where does that come from? Where does the idea of shaving your body come from? I don't know, but it's not nature. It's many, we're one of the few cultures that have that kind of beauty standard and expectation around women. Where is that coming from? Can we ask that question? Can we have these conversations about how to create a biblical, holistic view of beauty standards and what God intends people to be? And are our expectations being informed by that or by something else? And if it's something else, where is that coming from? And I would submit that Hollywood and advertising and pornography have conditioned us to have expectations around women and their bodies that are not right. They are not healthy. And those things mixed with pornography ramp people up into hypersexualized sins that just make animals of people. They really do. And then abuse happens. Then uncontrolled lust, like Amnon has, uncontrolled lust turns into actions and people are violated and abused. And so if we as a culture want to cut that off at the pass, we need to start thinking about how are we shaping our ideas around relationships, around expectations and beauty standards and what we want to be and what we expect of each other. And all of that matters because I don't want my children to inherit this culture's beauty standards and ideas around sex and identity and what it means to be either a man or a woman. I don't want my children to inherit those ideas. So I want to understand them. I want to cut them off at the pass. I want to see where they're coming from. I want to understand how things like Hollywood and advertising and commercialism have used women for sales. Women have been turned into a commodity for advertising. And it's all well and good that we try to get away from that, that we repulsed by it, that we don't have their magazines coming into our homes, that we're mindful of the billboards, that we teach our sons to turn away from immodesty. But we also need to understand its implications on a broader level and teach against those things and refine our own thought patterns and condition our children to think about their bodies and themselves the way that God does. I talk about this all the time. I've had conversations, usually in private, about, person to person, about things like women shaving their bodies. And I don't think it's a sin to shave your body. I don't care what you do. That's your business. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, where are these expectations coming from? And when you stop and analyze those expectations, whether it's makeup or shaving or whatever that is, I always ask myself, and I ask people I have this conversation with, when do you tell your daughter she's not pretty the way that God made her? When do you tell her she's not right the way she was created? When do you tell her, like if you use makeup, when do you tell your daughter, honey, you're kind of ugly if you don't put this on your face. You don't look right. With that blemish on your face, if you don't cover that up, people are going to think you look funny. If you don't do whatever, why would I would never say that to my daughter. I would never, ever say that to my daughter or my wife. And it offends me that women, God's creation, God's creatures, the people that he made with his own hands, would ever feel like if they didn't do something like that, they weren't right. They weren't valuable. They weren't esteemable. They weren't good. That has implications for our children in both genders. Young men shouldn't reproduce those patterns of thought. Young women shouldn't reproduce those insecurities and those ideas about themselves. There is nothing, can you imagine a sadder creature than the American teenage girl? All of the pressures put on her from the time she's little till she's fully grown, expectations that are constantly changing and forever unattainable. You don't measure up. You don't measure up. You're not quite it. I don't care how pretty you are. You will never match the photoshopped, airbrushed images that are being crammed down everyone's throat. You'll never match that. It's like it's a never-ending quest. Who is it? Was it Prometheus? Who is it? I'm not going to use that. I would feel like a failure as a father if my daughter ever felt that way. Any of my daughters. I want my daughters raised in an environment where they know they have a healthy idea of their value and their beauty and who they are as God created them. Because those insecurities and those vulnerabilities and those fears are exploited over and over again in people's lives. In bad relationships, in pressure to get involved in things that they shouldn't be involved in. There's nothing good that comes from those ideas. So these ideas and notions around beauty and identity and image are a part of this conversation that's important to have. It's important to have in your homes. It's important to have with your children. It's important to have around our tables and understand that that the world is pushing one way and we are pushing the other. We are not going to conform to those things, those unhealthy ideas that are being sold, literally sold. Women are not objects, and they're certainly not objects to decorate other things to make people want to buy them. That's vile. That's a crime against God and his creation, to exploit women for profit in any of its forms. And it is ubiquitous. It is happening all around us every day. in the grocery store aisle, on the freeway, like from one end of town to the other. That's exactly what is happening. Be very suspicious of your culture in regards to these things. They are broken. Dramatically broken. Out of step with what God's intentions are for men and for women. I want to speak briefly on children hurting children. Because there's something there's some different things about that. There are many people who in unsupervised environments have done inappropriate things as children with children. The kind of curiosity, and especially I think a lack of communication and a lack of supervision, lead to children being inappropriate with each other. That happened to me as a child. It happened to at least one of my brothers as a child. It's a surprisingly common instance. And the key, I think, to trying to combat that is to create the opposite environment, an environment of supervision and an environment of communication, where when there's curiosity, when a child is expressing curiosity about his body or other people's body, or her body or other people's bodies, there's a place to go with that and find answers. That it's not a taboo, that it's not a secret thing, that it's something that you know where you can find the information. And some training. If there is something that happens between children, I would encourage that household to get some advice and counsel about how to work through that situation and figure out what happened and how to prevent it in the future. I think there needs to be lots of education and talking and work through it. Work through why it's wrong without overreacting, without polarizing, without creating a new dynamic of shame instead of communication and education about those issues and how to prevent them from happening. I want to mention pornography and its role in abuse. I mentioned it in brief before, but pornography is like crack. It's like cocaine. And it works in a similar way in that it creates highs and lows. It creates a need for more. And we're messing with parts of our brain when we indulge in pornography that is more than meets the eye. We're wiring our brains. When you feed on that, you're teaching your brain to respond in very unhealthy ways. You're literally like an opiate addict. You're creating dependency cycles and addiction behaviors that are very hard to undo. Pornography is horrible for many, many reasons, but there's an untold cost to it that jacks people's brains up in really bad ways. And this isn't moralizing. It's the world knows this too. There's plenty of secular outfits to figure out what pornography is doing to people's brains. That dependency and addiction cycle causes escalating behaviors. And it's certainly not true that everyone who consumes pornography ends up abusing people, but I also think it's true that almost everyone who abuses people also uses pornography. Part of why I mention this here is that there's a preventative measure that the church can take in working through those issues with our men and making sure that we're living holy lives in regards to that, and in conditioning our young men how to deal with a world that has access to these kinds of things. We have all chosen, for one reason or another, to live in an urban environment. And that's because we're not retreating, because we, as a church, we want the kingdom of God present as a city on a hill. We're not retreaters. We're pushing the fight. We want to be on the front line of God's desire to redeem humanity. As such, we need to create tools and training and techniques to deal with exposure and access to evil things. We can't just put our head in the sand and put a little filter on our internet and assume that everything's okay. We need to be pressing in to developing techniques for men who have addiction to these things, for men who are tempted by these things, and for young men who get caught up in these things. We need to be proactive in repairing the damage that the world is doing through this vice. You know, as a father, things like internet filtering, they're good, but they're not. I think of it like I've never locked my cars because I knew car thieves. And anybody that wants in my car is going to get what they want. The only reason to lock your car is the opportunity thief, and they're quite rare. Internet filters are kind of the same thing. It's to stop opportunity theft. Anybody that wants to get through it, if they're determined, they'll figure out a way. It's important to do. I think it's a good, reasonable thing. But as fathers, if we're depending on that, if that's our set it and forget it for how to deal with these issues in our families, that's not going to work. We need to be talking about it. We need to be training about it. We need to be having conversations with our children and preparing to live in this world that we're in. The last thing I want to say, and I've taken about my time, the last thing I want to say is that one thing that I've learned in observing the situations most recently that have been happening in circles that we're all familiar with is that I want it to be well understood that there's not going to be any safe harbor for abuse among us and our people. Many of our people are in professions where they are mandatory reporters, and as a community, we are determined that if there's abuse in our midst, the government who has proper domain and authority over those issues will be notified. That's true at Sattler, it's true at the church, it's true in our businesses. There will be no safe harbor for abuse. There will be no public confessions of lust and then go on with their lives. If someone is hurt, people will be notified. The proper authorities have a domain and a responsibility to protect children and the society. And woe unto us or unto any church that prevents those authorities from doing their job when it comes to abuse. So I assume that everyone knows that and everyone accepts that, but I'm just going to put it on the public record so that we all know. If you hear of something, your obligation is to tell someone who has a responsibility to know. I've shared a lot here in all those things. My hope in this Citywide and in the future ones is that you take these thoughts and ideas and you take them to your congregations and it turns into conversations in smaller groups about these topics and these ideas. It turns into brainstorming and discussion and what about this and how do we do that? So please, about this in particular and any of the other issues that we discuss in our citywide meetings, take those into your homes, take that into your congregations, and continue to develop these ideas and use them for what they're useful for. Okay, I'm going to pray and then we'll close, and then I don't think we have to be out right away, so if anybody wants to hang around, we'll have some time to fellowship and visit. Why don't we stand and we'll pray, and then we'll be dismissed.